her.
It's hard to pull them away in their conversation.
I know, how fun.
I forgot to test the clicker for you. Did you just?
I didn't hear. Bye, guys.
Okay, I'm going to usher people in.
Where did I threw it in here because I was late. I'm not sure where I threw it. What's in my pocket? This is exciting. So did a lot of people come?
I think a lot of people are coming, yeah. I've been, to this, hopefully I've been telling people to come.
Or
so.
to the reunion.
Oh, to the
'cause it's
reunion.
Is it the first one
Since the pandemic?
times?
Yeah. So, and
That
this
is-
is our 10-year. I went to our 5-year. That was a very good turnout. So hopefully this year will be good too. So this is my 15th year.
Exciting. I was talking to my friend. I said, oh, yeah, why not reunions? I don't know.
But it's kind of a, I feel like most of the time it is kind of around like homecoming, fall stuff, but for 2 weeks ago, I live in Chicago, 2 weeks ago it was snowing.
I love Chicago. So I teach in a women's leadership program there, and I go once a year. And the best place to food.
Yeah.
Oh, we went to this really great museum. Was it Computers and Magazines?
You know what? I just went there about a month ago. Yes. Yeah, with the balls and everything. I know.
Really neat.
They're coming up with interesting stuff, and it's a great one. I took my 12-year-old there because I was like, that's perfect for that age where they don't want to be in the kids' museums anymore, and they're too cool for it. So it's a really nice museum.
Vacation. And of course, we're big fans of the World Kitchen.
Oh, okay.
Is it on Grace?
Okay. Yes.
That's food and emergency.
Yes, the bazaar. I went there. Did you go to the bazaar meets? Yeah, that's right. Very good. Yeah. Kind of the view of the city too.
Everyone moved back.
Should I ask questions about Harvard? About Harvard and everything that's going on, what they're doing. So basically, they're doing $1 million. They did a huge, because that was retro, and they did a huge retrospective Hi, I think we'll get started. Hi, everybody. My voice isn't loud enough. Welcome, and thank you all for coming. I'm Elizabeth Spenko, class of 2007. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Lori McKenzie. Lori's the lead strategist for diversity, equity, inclusion at the GSB, and co-founder of the new Stanford VMware Women's Innovation Lab. In her work at the GSB, Lori is pioneering small wins to make the classroom experience more inclusive, to diversify our community, and to foster new research in the areas of leadership, inclusion, and diversity, which she was just telling me about and sound extremely interesting, so we're in for a treat. In 2007, Lori was featured as one of the BBC's 100 Women in 2007, and is a keynote speaker to a wide range of audiences, from executive groups to women's summits. We're delighted to have her here today. Please join me in welcoming Lori.
Hello there, thank you for coming, and it's really a treat for you to spend time with me during your reunion, and I hope you're enjoying yourselves as much as possible. And we were just discussing snow in other parts of the country, so if you're not from California, also there's a weather treat, so hopefully the weather will hold out for you the whole time. I'm going to talk a little bit about the myths and the rituals of inclusion. And to kick us off, I want us, so how many of you have been on like a Zoom or a Teams call sometime in the past 2 years? Okay, so I want you to pose about how you are in your seat before the meeting starts. Okay, now imagine the Zoom or Teams starts. Show me what you do. Anyone do the, right? Now, why is it that we have expectations about how we are in our home, and then how we are the minute that camera comes on? That's what I want to talk about. There are myths, there are common beliefs we have about what work is, and those beliefs or myths shape how we behave, and when examined, can actually be a deterrent to creating a truly inclusive workplace where people can thrive. So I'm going to talk about that today, and then I'm going to go into a little bit about what GSB is doing about diversity, equity, inclusion here. So the definition of myth, interestingly found this in the dictionary, is a widely held but false belief. I knew myths were something to debunk, but when I looked it up in the dictionary, there it is. Something that is false, but widely held as true. And so when we look at the workplace, interestingly, many of our myths or expectations are widely held. But when we look at the data underneath them, they're actually false. One of them is, who is a good worker? And what does good work look like? We have widely held beliefs. In fact, I speak to a lot of hiring managers. How do you know the right candidate? Oh, I can tell. There's something about the way they answer questions. Again, what is that? So one of the things we know from research is that the ideal worker norm shapes who we think is the best employee. So the ideal worker norm was developed really when there became a separation of work and life during industrialization. Before that, there really was no separation of work and life. That construct came with industrialization. So if you think about, I don't know about you, but I grew up reading books like Little House on the Prairie. Anyone read that to your kids or grow up reading those? And if you recall, the people who owned the stores, the kids, Nellie Olson, would be playing in the store because there was no work and life, it was integrated. Or the farm, everyone contributed to the success of the farm, even the little kids. So this idea that there's work and life is an idea that came through industrialization, and then to make sense of it, we came up with expectations about what it was to be a good and productive worker, because we had never had office or factory workers before. And the definition started to be that when you're at work, you focus entirely on your job, And home is something that somebody else takes care of. And a lot of the laws reinforce this divide and this idea that anyone who's distracted from work is not a good and productive worker. Now, unexamined, these norms start to have things like what we might call a motherhood penalty. So research shows that if you have a gap or you indicate you're an officer in a parent-teacher organization, your resume is less likely to get called in. Not because you're not the perfect employee, but because this myth about who a good and productive employee is pervades today and affects how we see talent in our workplaces. Now, one myth I want us to work on today is this idea of a meritocracy. Many of our workplaces are designed around striving to be a meritocracy. So the idea of a meritocracy is that everyone is evaluated for the merit that they bring to the company, the project, to the team. And that every idea is truly evaluated based on the merit of that idea. We hold that belief widely. But research shows there's a lot of errors that we make that prevent us from truly seeing talent and ideas equally depending on the composition of the person, the identity of the person who's presenting the idea. So meritocracy is a belief, it's a myth, that all people and all ideas are evaluated based on merit. Now here's a really interesting finding. Emilio Castillo and Stephen Bernard, Emilio got his PhD here at Stanford. They did a research on a company, about a 5,000 person company. And they went to the leaders and said, what would you like to accomplish? And they said, we want to deliver on this promise of meritocracy. We believe a meritocracy is when we very carefully evaluate performance, and then when we give out salary increases, the performance correlates to the salary increase. So they worked with this organization, had them do that. They were very proud. By the end, they felt that they had truly correlated performance and pay increases. And then the second phase was the assignment of a merit bonus. And as you know, a merit bonus is a one-time bonus that's given based on your performance. So they asked the managers to hand out merit bonuses, and then they evaluated them, the researchers did, based on gender and race. And what they discovered was that the merit bonus was not linked to performance rating, but gender and race was more predictive of how much you got. And what they discovered is that if we believe in this myth of meritocracy, we are less likely to scrutinize our behaviors. So when managers work for what they believe are a meritocratic organization, they believe that they are the ones who are meritocratic. And what happens is they stop scrutinizing their behavior. So if all of us have what we call cognitive biases, where we make errors based on stereotypes about types of people, if we all do that and we stop scrutinizing because of the myth of meritocracy, research shows that we are likely to be more biased than if we have concerns that we're not good and check our behaviors. So how do you debunk this idea of meritocracy? One is there's a lot of research that shows how these errors take place. This one I really like. It's in the field of the legal scholars. And they wanted to convince lawyers that bias existed even in the legal field. And the lawyers said, well, no, our job is to find the truth. We're really good at looking through something and finding the truth. There aren't biases in the legal field. So what the researcher did was created a legal brief and put errors in it, spelling, theoretical, grammatical errors, sent it to law partners with the request to evaluate their third-year law student. And in it, they simply wrote in the cover letter for some that he is white and some that he's African American. And any lawyers in the house, you don't have to admit it. I've spoken to lawyers and they say, oh, who writes a brief doesn't matter. A brief is a brief. It stands on its own merit. Yet, what they discovered is that when the lawyers thought that Thomas Meyer was African American, they found those mistakes that the researchers had put in the legal brief. Now notice that they didn't find them regularly when they thought he was white. Now why would that be? The historical archetype of success affects how we evaluate things. In the past, there haven't been a lot of black legal partners. So despite the fact that, for example, Michelle Obama is a very well-known black legal partner, that hasn't affected our stereotypes or how we see success. So whoever doesn't match who we expect to be there just gets more scrutiny. And not only more scrutiny, but then Black Thomas Meyer, got a rating of 3.2, and we can't even believe he went to NYU. And white Thomas Meyer has potential, got a 4.1. And this is where the myth of meritocracy starts to fall apart. We do these studies in countries all over, right? Europe, Asia, where they change one thing in a resume and they send it to actual hiring managers, and they see how actual hiring managers respond. So we just talked about how race can affect evaluations. In the UK, what they did was, in some resumes, said that the person had been a member of a gay pride organization while in college. That one had to send in more resumes to get call-ins. The second one, in Germany, you can put a picture with your CV, the exact same picture. Sometimes they'd have a German name, sometimes a Turkish name, and sometimes Turkish with a headscarf. And that was the least likely to get called in. So you could say ethnic, national origin, or religious. And then the last one was the motherhood penalty I referred to. So when a resume says a person was officer in a parent-teacher association, it's called in less. That resume is called in less. Not only that, but the candidate is rated less qualified, less loyal, and offered a lower salary. Now, they did the same with 2 men's resumes. They put officer of a parent-teacher association at the bottom of a men's resume. It was called in more often, rated higher, more competent, and more loyal. So they call this the motherhood penalty and the breadwinner bonus. Now, I'm going to see how we're going to do with our own automatic associations. And if you wouldn't mind calling out, picture genius. And then who's willing to tell me the name of a genius? Anybody? Please. Maradona. Maradona? Oh, the same? Emmanuel Miranda. Lin-Manuel Miranda. Anyone else? Einstein? The Einstein. Clarence Tao had the highest IQ. So somebody who has the highest IQ would be a genius. So we have artistic geniuses, we have mathematical geniuses, we have scientific geniuses. In general, we tend to pick men as genius, in general, right? In general, when I do this, people in general say Einstein, which you threw me a bone. Thank you very much, appreciate it. And what's hidden from view are often women, people of color who are equally qualified in the exact same fields are hidden from view. So what happens in our brains is that when historical archetypes are in words like genius, it narrows our view. And we end up only seeing who matches that historical archetype. And even though there are a lot of other folks there, we tend not to notice them. If you saw when Forbes launched its very first 100 most innovative leaders in America list, there was a big Twitter storm because the list had 99 men and 1 woman. Now, when Forbes responded to this list, they said, well, we did use a methodology, but clearly it was flawed. So if you're not seeking to catch whether your methodology has these errors in it, likely you are enacting it. And that's how we try to debunk these myths of the workplace. by showing that these commonly held beliefs are false, but widely held, and we can debunk them with some of the data that research like that is done here at the business school is being conducted. Now, in this study, which was in 2019, they worked with a group of scientists, and they had them take that test to see if they had bias against women in science, and they discovered that pretty universally, just like in the world, people have bias, that men are more likely to be scientists than women. That's not what differentiated them. What differentiated the group was when they asked, why do you think there are so few women in science? And the ones that said, I don't know, science isn't sexist, we're empirical, were put in one group. Another group said, I don't know either, but I know barriers exist. And then they left them alone, and 2 years later went and looked at who they hired. And it turns out the group that acknowledged that barriers existed ended up hiring more women, and the ones that said, I don't know, science isn't sexist, we're empirical, ended up not hiring women. So whether you believe these myths or not, whether you seek to debunk them, can affect your behaviors in ways that reinforce the myths or can debunk them and come up with different outcomes. So when I think about the difference, it's not intention. Scientists in both of those groups had biases. And in most cases, people want to pick the best person. Very few people I talk to say, I hope I pick the second best candidate, right? But the difference are the actions we take to block these dynamics, these myths from affecting our decision making. And that's where I get to rituals. So again, I looked up the definition of ritual. It's an act or series of acts regularly repeated. So that's the thing about myths. If we do something once, it doesn't make the myth go away. We have to regularly repeat actions that block the myths from affecting our decision making to have any sort of different outcome. And in a way, I think about honoring who people are. I think about it as a ritual, which seems very much like a process, is actually trying to honor the person I'm trying to evaluate, really trying to see who they are beyond these automatic responses. So one way to debunk this myth of the ideal worker, so remember the ideal worker is the myth that people who have work and focus on work at work are more productive than those who have home concerns. One way to debunk the myth of the ideal worker is by having regular check-ins at work. Some really interesting work done by Leslie Perlow at the Harvard Business School. She was studying the Boston Consulting Group. And they were having issues because people were feeling like they had no control over their lives, and therefore this work-life integration was failing. So they instituted what they called 1 day off predictably a week. Now, if you're on a consulting project, it meant even if you're in a different state, you were off the project for 1 evening a week. It meant if you were buying tickets to a show or you're trying to see your kid's game, that you knew that night off was truly that night off. Well, the teams end up being more productive. Not because that 1 night off was necessarily rejuvenative, although it increased retention. But interestingly, because they had to coordinate across how their personal lives worked, they ended up communicating even more strongly about their projects. So some people argue, we don't have time for personal check-ins, we're about work. Work is work, and personal life is personal. But there's the chance that when you integrate them through a simple check-in at the beginning of the meeting, you can increase both work and personal satisfaction. By doing that regularly, it can change the tone of work over time, as Perlow saw in the Boston Consulting Group. A ritual can also be as simple as agreeing to criteria before you make a decision. If you remember that brief where the valuation of it shifted based unconsciously on the stereotype of the person evaluating it, well, research shows that we will shift the criteria. So if we recall, it was the exact same legal brief, but the criteria shifted in the valuation. It turns out if you simply think carefully about how you're going to evaluate someone before you do, you're less likely to shift it. So for example, in the legal brief, if someone had said, did you scrutinize for spelling mistakes equally in both briefs? Likely the ones who looked at the one from White Thomas Meyer didn't check that very well. Sadly, this happened to me once at work where we had candidates, and all of a sudden, the top candidate, someone said, oh, there are a lot of spelling mistakes in their cover letter. We didn't really notice it, but I think someone who's going to be in our role really needs to write well for the public audience. We really can't have spelling mistakes. And so we thought, oh, we should probably discount that candidate. What I didn't do, and I will regret forever, is that I didn't say, did you equally check for spelling mistakes in all the candidates? Because if we had, I'm sure we would have found a similar number. Because we didn't, we ended up saying this, okay, we took the person off the qualified list. So simply saying, if you're going to hold someone accountable for the way they're communicating or the way they're rating, did you really check to see that that was equally scrutinized on every applicant? Now, has anyone made a New Year's resolution that didn't stick? Kind of thing, yeah. And in fact, a lot of people make New Year's resolutions around eating. Like, I don't know about you, but do you notice I'm wearing this little top that's looser on the bottom than it is up here? This is what I call COVID clothing. Right? You got the nice snug part where it doesn't count, and then a nice loose part where the COVID effect has taken place. So lots of people have given me advice about what to do about COVID clothing. And interestingly, a lot of the things you're supposed to not do make me want to do it more. Have you ever tried that? Like, I'm only going to drink wine, on the weekends, and then have a really tough meeting, like, oh, tonight I'll just have one glass, right? So there's ways that telling me not to do something makes me want to do it more. So it turns out in behavioral economics, there's this idea of a nudge. A nudge doesn't tell you not to do something, but a nudge encourages you to do the right thing. It constrains your choices so you end up doing the right thing without having to remember to. Now, a good example is anyone not from the United States here. Are you shocked about how big our servings are? It's like you could feed a family off of one plate of food. Like, seriously, I went to this one meal, and I can't believe I was eating it all. And in reflection, it was the amount of food that we usually buy for my family of 4, but I ended up eating it because it was on this really beautiful plate, and we were there. And so it turns out the plate size in the United States has increased over time, similarly to a lot of the ways that we've started to eat more. So if you simply eat off a smaller plate, it's not telling me, Lori, don't eat more. It's just saying, like, how much fits on this little plate. So one way to help people with good behavior is not to tell them, don't eat more. It's really to figure out, you've heard it, smaller plates, healthy sizes, eat slowly, all those things. Okay, so it turns out if you in your work are making decisions about people without some sort of scorecard, likely you are making these shifts. Even if your company has some sort of performance evaluation or hiring platform, if you as a leader require that everyone do and input their evaluations into a scorecard, you're going to get less of this shifts in evaluation. If you, in your agendas, just regularly put that check-in, at first it will be awkward, but over time, you'll get more accustomed to integrating work and life and have less of a barrier. Even during COVID, a lot of women told me there was understanding about them having kids kind of running through their Zoom screen. And yet when we ask about promotions and opportunities and how they feel their advancement is going, they still feel like it was a constraint. One thing a check-in can do is help reduce that myth that people with things going on outside of work are less productive than those who focus solely on work. And then I love this idea of changing the default. So it turns out that unbeknownst to us, we have defaults about the way life works. If you think about, for example, parental leave. Often it's structured around biological parents, which in some organizations they have to rewrite it to include, for example, adoptive parents or step parents, right? So the default is a biological parent. By shifting that, it creates more inclusion in organizations. Well, the way we talk also has a lot of defaults. So if you say, for example, I want to welcome all the couples and the same-sex couples. What I'm saying is the default is a one-man, one-woman couple, and everyone else is an exception. So our words have ways of, again, indicating who is more included in our organizations and who is an exception. And if you've noticed around Stanford, a lot of us will put our pronouns on our Zoom IDs, or when we work with undergrads, it's often incorporated into how they introduce each other. Now, why is it important that everyone shares their pronoun? Well, it shifts the default. The myth is that there's a default and everyone else is the exception. But by shifting the default, we're debunking that myth. So by sharing my pronouns, my name's Lori McKenzie, I use she, her pronouns, I'm saying the default is that we all might have different pronouns than you expect, and therefore it's just the way it is that we share them. So in your workplaces as well, there may be defaults that are unconsciously being reinforced, where there's something without, right, a descriptor, and everyone else gets a descriptor. And the question is, could you catch those and make it so that everyone is included, not a default and an exception? Okay. Now, what have we done here at the business school around some of these myths and some of the ways to create a more inclusive campus? And if you didn't know, we've been publishing a diversity, equity, inclusion report for the past few years. This is our third report, which just came out. And in all honesty, we keep shifting when we publish it, so it's not like you would know it comes out at a certain time of year. We rely on central Stanford data about our representation, and we are kind of working out when that comes in and then when we write a report. But I wanted to share a little bit with you about how we've tried to be more inclusive in the work we do. So one of the myths that we as a university, as people need to debunk is that, well, everyone can be their authentic self. And there's lots of data that shows that's not true equally for everybody. So one thing Stanford University did was they conducted the largest scale culture survey ever in our history. President Tessier Levine launched it after the murder of George Floyd and said he wanted us to understand how race affected how people felt here at Stanford. Almost 15,000 people answered this survey. It's the very first survey we've ever conducted across students, staff, and faculty. Exact same survey. Because what we wanted to understand was, how is it that people are experiencing the culture? Is that myth true that everybody can equally be their authentic selves? This survey, you can find it online. They've put all the results to be available because transparency also helps debunk myths, giving everyone access to data. What they discovered was that race and sexual orientation, sexual identity, play a huge role in how people feel that they belong here on campus. So what have we done about that? We pilot what we call a small wins approach to change. It's hard to change the whole culture, so we take bits of it and we try to evolve it in some of the ways that I talked about today. So one of the things we did was last year we said we want all of our resources, developing new cases, to focus on leaders of color. And it went from just 1% of our cases being to adding 35 new cases last year. And I heard one of the students share in a course saying, This was the first time when I was in my class and there was a protagonist of color talking about their startup. Not talking solely about being a protagonist of color or like an entrepreneur of color, but being one and sharing about their amazing startup. So it really can go a long way in having our students feel like, yes, they truly can thrive regardless of how they look or where they come from. We've also thought about how we can help our faculty create more inclusive classroom experiences, and this just ended, the student panel was just this week. So we did a couple of things. First, 2 years ago, we launched a training called Sensitive Topics in the Classroom, where we talked about how to manage sensitive topics that come up through current events or case studies that could inadvertently, or comment that could inadvertently cause someone to feel like they didn't belong. And then this year what they did was we went a step further. First, we had a panel and invited faculty to attend of 3 faculty who shared their experience of both creating an inclusive classroom, but also dealing with pushback against their identities in the classroom and what they did. And then just this week, Will Torres, who works in our admissions, curated a panel of 5 students who shared their experiences in the classroom when it wasn't inclusive, or shared how amazing it is when professors did certain things to have their identities be welcome in the classroom. So again, how do we as a business school, as a leading business school, create environments where everyone can equally see that they thrive? We had a conversation with staff on Thursday with Brian Cook, who works in our institutional research, and Ayodele Thomas, who is the head for staff, diversity, equity, inclusion for all of Stanford, where we wanted to tell them, we're gonna share these survey results with you and go through them with you so everyone understands. We're not hiding the data. We're sharing the data so that we can all think about ways that we can reduce the barriers for people feeling like they belong. And lastly, we've been looking at the curriculum we do. I don't know, has anyone been to Building Momentum? So it was originally designed for women alums, entrepreneurs, to help them succeed in the ecosystem of entrepreneurship. And then in 2021, pivoted it, thinking, well, we're online, why don't we take advantage of that? Instead of being just for women, the idea was to advance diversity and to give access to the amazing curriculum offered here at the business school to anyone who was able to log on. And as you can see, there were 355 people who attended, and there were requirements for registering. It wasn't just if you were interested in hearing. And 62% of them ended up being non-alums, which was really great for us to share our good work. And 50% of our attendees were either Black or Latino, US-based attendees. So thinking about our curriculum, our classroom experience, our staff, trying to debunk the myths that it's fine the way it is, and figuring out how we can be proactive in creating more inclusion and more to be proud of here at the business school. If you haven't read it, it's on our website. If you just look for Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Report, we have 6 priorities that we work on here, and we've been working on for the past 3 years. 1, to increase the diversity of our Stanford community. 2, to create an inclusive classroom and learning experience. To create an inclusive and welcoming campus community. Support new research efforts, especially around diversity, equity, inclusion. Share our good ideas with the world, as with the conference I shared about. And then we've integrated our action plan for racial equity into the core report with the last priority, which is to address racial inequality in our community and society. So while we still have a lot of work left to go, we're gonna keep trying to debunk these myths and install nudges and rituals so that we can, not only for ourselves, the student experience, but hopefully, as that saying goes, change lives, change the world, change organizations, change the world. Hopefully, by debunking the myths, we will create more opportunities to for people to truly achieve their fullest potential. So that's it for now with this talk, and what I'd love to do now is see if there are any questions or comments from either our online audience or from you here. Please, please. I think they're going to bring microphones so that the people online can hear the questions, so thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'm curious for the goals that you just showed. How do you know you're achieving success, and I use OKRs at work, but what do we want to shift from what percentage to what percentage, or what sort of more quantifiable goals can we put towards them?
That's a great question. So I think you're likely talking about diversity, because that would have some numerical measures that we could look at. Our numbers, if you go to the ideal dashboard at Stanford, you can look up any of our numbers for faculty, students, staff, and the gender and racial composition of them. So at all times, we've made transparent what our numbers are. Now, universities have challenges around stated goals. If you've followed any of the lawsuits in our space about universities that have tried to list numerical goals, it's not really possible. But by reporting and tracking it, we definitely can keep pushing towards that with initiatives such as the Bold Fellows, which make our participation here at GSB more widely available, or with trying to engage different folks in coming to the business school. We're part of a pilot. We're one of the first units that's part of a pilot launched by Stanford to bring in different recruiters that help us identify candidates from different backgrounds. So by investing in those opportunities and constantly reporting our diversity numbers, that's how we are aiming to keep ourselves accountable. Now, in terms of culture, Stanford's not necessarily going to launch the exact same survey year over year, because there were aspects of that survey that weren't captured. But we can look at numbers like that as well and hold ourselves accountable to aiming to have those numbers increase. So it's perhaps less directive than you would find at a company that can have specific targets, but it's something that we are being transparent about and investing in the pathways to achieve more diversity in our communities.
Thank you for all the work you do and this presentation. One question I have is, in your last slide, if I perceived the goals correctly, it seemed to me that one of the goals was not to better equip business leaders to lead diverse, equitable, and inclusive organizations. Like along the lines of the first part of your presentation, where you were equipping us to better lead, it seemed like that was not a goal, but you were trying to create more inclusive classrooms, but not to teach those types of things to every person who graduates from here. And I wonder what your thoughts on that are, because if we want to advance, a better business leadership, more inclusive society, that seems like a great opportunity for me to Stanford to lead.
I agree with you. And so I'll just talk a little bit about the case studies as an example. If you are preparing to be a venture capitalist and you learn about entrepreneurship here at Stanford and you've never read a case about a protagonist who was not white, that shapes your ability as a venture capitalist to think about investing. But by providing materials in the classroom that normalize diversity and inclusion, that can shape how you are as a leader. Now, I'm really old. I went to a different business school, apologize for that, in the 1990s. And at that time, the question was what to do with global. They didn't call it global, they called it international. Do you have marketing and international marketing? Or do you put international in every class? And that was a debate. There was a huge debate about that. In retrospect, it seems kind of silly to think, of course, it's part of everything we do. Why would you have a class called, unless it was specifically about how to look at global markets or something like that? So where they ended up with is, let's integrate that into everything we do. marketing, accounting, finance, operations as part of what it is to manage that area. So the long game would be to imagine cases and examples that integrate this into every kind of curriculum or field of study. Now, in the meantime, what we piloted this year was what we called the DEI Arc of Learning that all first years were invited to take part of. So Sarah Sewell, who's our Senior Associate Dean who oversees diversity, equity, inclusion, created an entire curriculum for the first years to discover what this is. What is this power of inclusion? What is the power of diversity, both in their intellectual curiosity, but also how they interact with each other in the classroom? So we're piloting different things. Next year it'll probably look a little bit different, but we implemented that curriculum this year, to your point, so that it's something that we expose our students to from the day that they enter our campus.
The ones that opt in.
Pardon me?
Is it the ones that opt in? So it seems to me like what you just said, seems you invite your students. So is that opt-in, an opt-in program, or is that something that all students go through? And from the cases, what I infer is that you're bringing more examples of people of color leading. So to me, it seems you're normalizing it, you're helping break stereotypes. But what I'm not hearing is the type of teaching that you did in the first half of this presentation, where you're saying you don't need to only normalize it, you actually need to think through and be proactive about what your rituals are, what your processes are, where you're going to be nudging. And that seems to me to be not in your goals. Is that true? And are all students getting the type of training that you went through today?
Yes, so maybe it's not explicit, but it is why we integrate this curriculum into our goal of inclusive classroom experience. There's different debates about whether we should make diversity inclusion training mandatory. The research shows that when it's mandatory, it becomes kind of like a compliance mindset versus something that we want to achieve as good leaders. So you're catching us in the middle of an experiment where we invited, and as you know, there's peer pressure at the beginning of a program for folks, and really anticipated that many students would, and there was a great participation in the very beginning. And exploring exactly what the right balance is between requiring people to do this and inviting them to do it. I would say the jury's still out. I'm with you that it makes better business leaders, absolutely. We have several opt-in courses that people can participate in as well, such as Equity by Design that Professor Adina Sterling leads. There are other ways that the identity groups lead programming throughout the year so people can understand each other and get to know the barriers that their colleagues face. And what I'm curious about is that when somebody from their values of leadership opts into those experiences and sees it as part of something they want to learn to be a better leader, what does that advance versus someone who's told you have to learn this? It's a little bit about, I don't know, when I do work with organizations, the challenge is that we're all entering it at very different places. Even what the words mean have become a little bit American. When people hear diversity, they think of it a little bit more in American terms, and I've heard in some European countries they call it pluralism. So one of the challenges is we just have a lot of entry points. We have a lot of thinking about who we want to be as leaders, and we're trying to include it in the container of what it means to be somebody who changes the world for good. We'll see if our avenue is correct, but I'm hoping, we're intending, and we'll keep revising it until we get the formula right. And then we will be the leader saying, well, it took us a while, but here's the formula, we think it really works. And hold us accountable.
Hey there. So
Yes.
I'm curious if there are any particular efforts or programs to onboard people into the context when they come, as I came 12 years ago to the GSB as an immigrant. I would say, being very open with this group of mostly strangers, it's only really after George Floyd that the context of 1619 and the American imperative became very obvious to me. So I wonder, with new people moving to America, kind of connected to your last comment, is that on your radar? Is there any research? It strikes me that that might be an interesting question to ask.
That's a great question. So the way the Arc of Learning was designed was with some self-study and reflection before we gathered for that very reason. And the challenge is we have some students who have studied this, who've lived it, who've run ERGs, and then we have some who don't know what the difference is between inclusion and diversity, really, like what it really means, what the difference really means. So what we tried to do to accommodate that was to have some self-learning before people entered the classroom. So if you imagine if you watched a video and then reflected on it and thought about how it pertains to yourself before you went into discussion, if you didn't understand that context or even thought about, well, what's the equivalent context where I come from? Because in some places it's social class. In some places it might be national origin. So I think one of the challenges is when we say race, people from other countries often think, yeah, Americans are really bad at it. And it prevents them from seeing like every country has a way that their stereotypes of success keep some people out. And we're trying to develop curriculum that helps people see the global dynamic, but also realizing we're studying this in the United States as a very specific US-based context. And it's, again, I think we're in the middle of this experiment. That was our attempt to try to bring people up to speed. The criticism we got about the year before was we kind of brought everyone in and expected them to have a certain understanding, and it was uncomfortable for those who were not prepared to have these discussions. So again, evolving it. Oh, please.
Hi, thank you for all of this info. I gotta tell you that there's just a disconnectedness of what is being presented and what is actually on campus and the experience that even current students are having. And so how do you bridge some of these gaps of hate crimes that are going on campus? And we talk about a culture, there's a culture of hate that exists here, and this is devoid of addressing that in any positive way. It seems like reality is going in one direction, and what's being presented is this fluffy language of we're going to include, and it's very glossy and high level, and again, disconnected from specific goals, objectives, metrics, timelines. We don't know if this is going well. It's clearly not, based on some recent hate crimes, and so how do you connect these two, this report with actual?
That's a great question. So we have a lot of people working on culture and inclusion here at the business school, and we debated, should we publish the report? Because we are in the middle of a really terrible incident of hate on our campus that doesn't reflect where we want to go or who we are. So we wondered, should we honor the work of the folks who are working on it and showing the efforts we were making, or hold it off? And what we decided was to publish the report with a lot less fanfare, I think, than we have in the past, because it reflects the work that's been done. It doesn't reflect all of who we are. And if you read the letter that Sarah Sewell wrote that frames it, she addresses that directly in the letter, that more than ever, we're clear about the work that we have to do here. Now, a lot of work has been done to support the students who went through it. If you meet Arthel Coleman, who runs our residences, he's our hero. He was on site in the middle of what was happening, and like nothing else but student care was top of his mind. Does that mean we've solved the problem? Absolutely not. We have work left to do. We intend to keep, like the myth of meritocracy, keep that front and center of what we do. Now, here's the other thing. Staff were affected by this as well. So immediately after the event, we held a number of safe spaces for staff to be able to reflect on what it was for them to be in this environment where this is happening. And we, again, brought the DEI survey results in, which were pretty negative about a lot of dynamics that happen based on race and sexual identity on campus. And we said these dynamics are happening between employees and their managers. And this is not something out there, this is in here, and we are gonna work on pathways to address it. So you're right, there was a terrible incident that happened on campus. We are not where we need to be. And the question we've been grappling with is, can we continue with these small win efforts which are intended to shape the dynamics while also making sure that the specific incidents, people, relationships that are being affected by things that are happening on campus, that we support them to our best of our being. So we're trying to do both, and we have a lot of work left to do. And thank you for bringing that up.
Can I just have one follow-up on that?
Sure. Zach.
So just, it's even using language like it's an incident, as if it's a one-off. It's not one-off. This has happened numerous times, and it continues to happen over time. That's culture, and that can only exist in a culture of hate. And when the response is similar to other events, other incidents, occurrences, then we should have learned by now, and we haven't. And that's the sort of the frustration that it's like, well, we should be more transparent about it. We talked about being transparent for all these metrics, but we haven't been transparent about that, and that's pretty important. And so that's sort of the disconnect that I'm looking for in the how do you connect what we're saying versus what we're doing and what we're actually, what is actually exists on campus.
Well, that's what the culture survey was intended to identify. And it specifically looks at occurrences over the past 2 years of microaggressions. Now, the survey didn't say, have you experienced a microaggression? The survey said, has anyone turned away from you on campus? Not strangers, but somebody who works here at Stanford. Ask questions like, have you ever had your opinion discounted in the past 2 years by somebody at Stanford? So the survey, to your point, asked all of those questions and opened it to students, staff, and faculty, including our doctoral students. And we have the data that show that, for example, while the incidents have experienced this, everyone's experienced it, for our Black students, for our trans TGNC students, the rates are significantly higher. And that they're not happening by strangers walking across our campus. They're happening by supervisors and managers and faculty. So we are bringing this data into our conversation and saying, how are we going to create pathways to fix this culture here? So I agree with you. It's, I was one of the people who answered, yes, I have experienced these dynamics on campus. It's not a surprise to me that many of my colleagues and students have also experienced these dynamics. We now have the data that show how it plays out across race and a little bit about sexual identity, gender identity. And I think we got the data, the survey was completed at the end of last year, and we got access to the data this year. And we're holding 3 design sessions with our staff to talk specifically about those outcomes and what we're going to do about it. Now, again, you might say, I wish you had figured that out before, and what I can say is this is what we are working on today. And like you, I really wish, right, that there was more that had been done before, and yet all I can do is say, you can hold me accountable that what we're going to be working on, not thinking it's a one-time incident, a one-time person, but this is part of our culture that we need to address, that we will do the work.
Lori, we have time for just one more
Right.
short question.
Please.
Thanks, Lori, and thank you for this. I appreciate it. It's great to see it. You know, getting back to the question of metrics, how are you thinking about metrics that are related to early drivers, like the scorecard example you mentioned, or having kickoff conversations, or ensuring that you're thinking about equitable sourcing practices, mentoring, and making sure that mentoring's happening across, versus outcomes like representation? Are you measuring both, and how are you looking at those leading indicators that then lead to the bigger representation number that everyone looks at, but that's an outcome?
So I guess it's a little different for each population, but I don't know if you saw that we've joined the consortium, which is a way to have people from different backgrounds get access to applying at GSB, for example, without paying the fee and have different access. So we've joined the consortium for students. For staff, we are part of the first pilot that Stanford's launching to diversify the sourcing and recruiting that we do for staff here on campus. There's different initiatives like the research fellows for postdoctoral students that used to only be in economics, but now is across many of our disciplines, that with the aim to bring people who are underrepresented in our faculty line, our doctoral line, to a 2-year program that greatly enhances their chance of getting into a top program when they complete, whether it's at Stanford or elsewhere. So we are definitely investing in different pathways to enable more folks to see this as a place they want to be and to thrive. In terms of other ways that we're thinking about scorecards or other ways that we might think about evaluations, we've, for example, in hiring, are looking at all of our competencies and coming up with more, what we know, better practices around behavioral interviewing that are more likely to allow people with different backgrounds to shine in interviews. So we're really working to figure out how we can bring these ideas to everything that we do in campus. We have more work to do, but what I know is that we won't keep our foot off, we'll keep our foot on the gas pedal.
Thank you so much.
Right, thank you for coming today. And I'm happy if you want to talk. And if anyone has any additional questions, I'll be here too if you want to keep the conversation going. Our next session is going to start in just 5 minutes.
Use the mic.
that. I'm just using that one. So in a minute, we're gonna wait a couple more minutes and see if we can drive anyone else out. It's always hard. You want good weather for the reunion, but then everybody wants to see the good for the reunion, right?
You should be arriving soon.
Yeah. Yeah, notice he's on. Darren? All right.
right, everyone, we're going to go ahead and get started. Wow, that was fast. Thank you to those of you who we were able to drag away from this incredible California weather. So excited to see you all. My name is Renee Hirschberg, and I am the Senior Director of Alumni Relations here at the GSB. I just joined the GSB this past November, so I am so excited to experience my first GSB reunion as part of the community, and to also be the one that gets to welcome you to Spring Reunion. So welcome, and welcome back to campus. It's hard to believe we're actually here. There were times we thought this wouldn't happen. Lots and lots of times we thought this wouldn't happen. So it's an extra cause to celebrate this weekend, and I hope you take the time to do that. I had plans to do a whole, let's point out who's in the audience and the classes and all that good stuff, but it seems like the weather may have changed those plans. But I do want to call attention to the 5 classes that are here today celebrating. We have, and let's hear a cheer for you if you're here for your class. The class of 2002. Yeah, pretty good, guys. 2007. Yeah, nice. 2012. Yay! 2017. I'm good. Nice job. And then, I don't know if we'll get any cheers, but we should all cheer for these guys. They're definitely the ones who have the most unique GSB experience yet. The great MBA class of 2021. They're not here, but let's give them a round of applause. I'd also just like to take a minute to recognize all of the volunteers that make this weekend happen and make it so special. If you volunteered for your reunion events team or your reunion fundraising, can you just raise your hand for us? Yay! Thank you so much. We often say in alumni relations that we can't do a quarter of the work we do without our volunteers, and that includes board members, chapter and identity, identity and regional chapter volunteers, business school fund volunteers, class secretaries, ACT project volunteers, CMC admissions, classroom volunteers, event speakers. There are so many. So thank you so much to each and every one of you for being an addition to our team and an extended member of our team. Thank you. So with that, I would like to wish you a wonderful reunion. Enjoy celebrating, reflecting, and connecting. And please, if you see me, since I'm new, I would love to meet you. Stop me, say hello, tell me about your GSB experience. I really want to absorb all of it this weekend, and I look forward to that. So cheers, welcome to Reunion. And now I am very excited to welcome to the stage Dean Levin, as well as Professor Neil Malhotra for their fireside chat. So, give a round of applause.
Great. So welcome. Really terrific to see everyone here for reunions, and I have to say it's really an incredible pleasure to get to bring back spring reunions after a pause for 2 years, and feel the energy and just have you all here, and I hope you all get to enjoy that and benefit from it. I'm really glad to have Professor Neil Malhotra here. We're going to talk a little bit about social impact at the school. I thought I would just start before we get going, just by saying briefly that we've had as you can imagine, just a really unusual last 2 years at the school. The class of 2021, which is back for their first reunion, lived through much of it, and this year has been in many ways just glorious to get everyone back on campus, and you probably got a sense of it outside, but it really has. At least for me, one of the things about the COVID experience is it really has just brought a renewed appreciation for how special this place is at full strength when the faculty are milling around and the students are milling around and the collisions that happen and the alumni that come back to campus. And I think it's reminded all of us of just how unique the environment is on this campus and how unique it is to have this sort of open architecture on the campus where people come together and there's just room for discussion and collaboration and forming relationships and learning. And it's been great. It's been a very, very special year in many ways. I've been at Stanford for 30 years, and this year it's been a super special year. So I'm really glad that you get to be coming back for reunions and getting a little bit of a taste of that in this special year. And we'll go to some questions, and happy to talk about all of that. I will say the school I think the state of the school is really strong. We're continuing to see students who are just as brilliant as you all were when you came, and maybe even more brilliant potentially, but that's debatable. We've had a wonderful year with our faculty. We had a faculty member earlier this year win the Nobel. We've had actually the last 2 years we've had 2 Nobel Prizes at the school, which is kind of cool. I mean, we always say we're the one business school that produces incredible business leaders like all of you and Nobel Prizes at the same time. So it's been a good period for that. And we're in a period of really interesting and exciting collaboration with the university, which I think Neil will talk a little bit about that in certain ways. But we're about to start a new climate and sustainability school at Stanford, and that's been a big topic of enthusiasm and excitement this year, is thinking about the intersection of business and sustainability. Of course, that's going to, I think, be an important topic for many, many aspects of business, and the potential that we have to marry some of the incredible science, engineering, climate modeling, and all of that that's going to go on around the university with this new school with our entrepreneurship, management, leadership, and bring those things together. Okay, so with that, Neil, nice to see you in this context.
Great seeing you.
So Neil is the director of the Center of Social Innovation at the GSB. And maybe just start actually by saying a little bit about how you ended up at the GSB and how you got interested in social innovation.
Sure. So I'm actually a political scientist by training. So I actually did my PhD across the street in the political science department here at Stanford. And I've always been kind of interested in the intersection between business, government, and society. And that's kind of a lot of what my research focus is on. And I would say in 2007, when I was working on all of this, people didn't think it was a big deal. And I would say that since 2008, and just on an exponential trajectory, I think business leaders have to really understand kind of how politics works, how government works, and it's just a crucial part about being a CEO. And I think it was always like this. R.J. Miller, former dean, started the public management program here. But I think really all business leaders, and especially over the last 2 years, including yourself, have realized how important it is to just be in tune with various stakeholders across society. You can't just narrowly focus on my supply chain, my investors, the capital markets, but thinking about activists, stakeholder groups, all of these things. And so because I think that's something I've always been interested in, the intersection of business and society, it kind of naturally led to this leadership role of social innovation and using business not only to intersect with society, but also improve it, to use kind of the functions of management organization to improve and make the world a better place to live in, whether it's health, environment, education, all these sectors.
And so from that perspective, where are you seeing the current student interest? Like, what are the set of problems and issues where you see the most passion these days?
Sure. I think it's always been in the GSB's DNA to be of entrepreneurship, and I kind of view that as a mindset, not an occupation. I think oftentimes we think of entrepreneurship as someone who starts a company and gets Series A funding or something like that, but I think our students, no matter what they choose to do, go out with an entrepreneurial mindset. So that can include working for a small company. It can be innovating within a Fortune 500 company. I think Mary Barra is a great example of that. But I would say that if you think about how students approach their time at the GSB, is that they want to leverage entrepreneurship really for a social function, which is to make the world a better place. And it's unsurprising because over the last 20 years, they've seen traditional institutions fail at making the world a better place. So government, many like large foundations or nonprofits, so they see the private sector as sort of the vehicle to make improvements in all of these sectors. And I think you see the rest of the world do that too, with new forms of organization like B corporations and benefit groups, things like that, impact investing. That's, I think, where a lot of the student excitement and mindset is how to use the power of organizations and businesses to make everyone's lives better.
And so, as your CSI role, you've spent a lot of time thinking about, what is the pathway for students to get involved in social impact, and how do you create that from the applicant pool and admissions all the way through to careers? Mm-hmm. You want to give everyone a sense of sort of how the strategy has evolved there over time and how you think of it now?
Sure. So I mean, I doubt anybody in this audience remembers this, but the PMP used to be a program you would apply to get into, and we don't really do that anymore. We have a general management degree, but I think our application question, what matters to you and why, is just a universally powerful question. And it's a question that I think we admit the kind of students that are very in line with the mission of the Center for Social Innovation. So the selection of people who come in, I never worry about that. So I'm just saying, with all these people who have the right mindset, what kind of programming do we build to really energize and accelerate their career and their dreams? And so we do both curricular and co-curricular programming. So curricularly, we actually run the only certificate you can get at the GSB outside your degree. So as you know, there's only 3 degrees you can get at the GSB: an MBA, an MSX, and a PhD. Many other schools have majors and minors, but we have always believed in a single degree that defines kind of the GSB experience. But we have a history of this certificate in public management and social innovation. And that certificate is organized in many, many courses taught by our full-time faculty, the practitioners who come and teach here. And it basically has a pathway where the first set of classes people take is to really learn an issue, to really learn about the problems facing the education sector, whether it's K through 12 or secondary, healthcare, education. And then we actually teach them about impact measurement, so how you actually measure impact when you have a business. And then finally, kind of how you run businesses with all the issues related to scaling, et cetera. So that's kind of the set of classes we teach. But I think what I'm really excited about is all our co-curricular programming. So we, for example, have an impact fund where we have real money that goes into source deals in the impact space. It's basically an impact investing fund that's run by the students. Many other business schools have now copied our idea, which my first reaction was I'm a little bit upset about that, but my second was imitation is always the greatest form of flattery. And it's such a unique program because in a room you can have faculty, students, staff, alumni, all working together on the same mission, which is to deploy this capital for social benefit. And there's something like 13 or 14 companies in the portfolio right now. The students get so much experience on how you present from a management committee, how you source a deal, and it's not theoretical. They're actually taking the real money to do this. So that's a very exciting program. And then the second one is just our social entrepreneurship program, where we have a whole pathway linked to many classes. We teach like Startup Garage, where we kind of have students who have germinal ideas in a social startup, and we take them all the way to start them getting funded, and we have pitch competitions, and we have the flagship is the Social Innovation Fund, which gets them started so that kind of the money is not the reason they don't find their social venture. So just a few weeks ago, we had the finals of it. We awarded some winners. We can't announce the winners right now, but it was just a great event. And it's just really nice how the classroom learning and this kind of extracurricular learning really feed into each other really nicely.
You want to give an example or two of the social entrepreneurial companies that have come through the CSI program? And just, by the way, the students who go through this, at the end, some of them get a small award, but some of them get a significant award so that supports them for a year after graduation to get a social venture off the ground. So that's the big prize that you could get going through this program. And I don't know, maybe you want to give a couple of examples.
Sure, I'll give you a couple of examples. Yeah, and I think these two examples kind of show what social entrepreneurship is about. Like, these are company ideas. You couldn't really go to Sand Hill Road and get Series A funding, because they're not like unicorn potential companies, because their goal is to not maximize as much money as possible, but rather to address a social problem. So one of them that was very successful, that was founded a few years ago, found that like one of the major problems in Rwanda was that many people live on dirt floors. And there's been a lot of research to suggest that being on a dirt floor just increases all of these illnesses, including childhood illnesses, which cause people to lose their life within the first 5 years. So her company is basically replacing these floors that are dirt floors with other materials like earthen, concrete, et cetera. And this is like real impact. I think she's already installed over 4 million square feet of flooring. And you know how small people's houses are. That like is so much impact for so many people to put this much flooring to replace. And another example closer to home is that, as people might know, it's a challenge to find childcare for everybody. But for hourly workers, it's incredibly difficult. And a lot of the frictions in the economy right now are because hourly workers cannot find childcare. And so we had a woman who starting a company, and she's doing a pilot with a major Fortune 500 company to basically have these benefits packages to provide childcare for hourly employees. And this is really important because all of the incumbent players in this space, you think of Care.com, Bright Horizons, they don't touch this space because it's very much an innovator's dilemma problem. They know what their niche is, which is the salaried employees. They're moving into things like, how do we get tutoring for these salaried employees, SAT prep? They're not focusing on the lower end of the market, which are these hourly workers. Yet this is where I think a lot of the social impact can be to alleviate this major source of stress for people who really need it. So those are just two examples of what social entrepreneurship is about and really creative, clever ideas that come out of here.
What are the barriers for students who want to do social entrepreneurship?
Well, I mean, I think the obvious one is money, right? That I think students invest a lot when they come here. A lot of that investment is opportunity cost. And it's just very tempting to say, well, even if I want to start a company or go into the social space, I got to work in the private sector first, like kind of what we call kind of profit maximizing private sector first. And then maybe 20 years down the line, I can get back to my dream of working in the social sector. And so that's a barrier. And I think kind of one dream I have is that people, if they want to, whatever they want to do in the GSB, that money is not the reason they decide to do one thing or the other. So that kind of the finances, I hope, is not going to be the barrier going forward.
I want to ask you a question that I actually don't know what you think on this question, but I'm curious to, just as you're talking, we were talking about, you referred back to the PMP program before, and this question I've thought about, so I'd love to hear your thoughts about, which is that when the PMP program was originally set up, if you all know the history of the PMP program, was set up by R.J. Miller back in the early 1971. And the goal was to get more GSB students working in government. And I'm curious about how you think about that goal today. It morphed over time into being more about social innovation, social entrepreneurship. But I'm curious how you think about that question of, should we have more students that we're preparing to go into government?
Yeah, I think it's a fascinating question. So I can at least give you some insight based on all the lunches and coffees I have with students. And the Nixon administration actually hired a lot of PMP graduates. It was a really powerful program that changed a lot of how government worked in the 1970s. And the basic idea is that you want to train government officials to have all the skills of managers that they have. And so people working in the administrations, all the bureaucracies, should have the great training that an MBA provides. That was kind of the original thinking, and that maybe government can run more efficiently if you have people with that mindset. That was kind of the idea. And I think over time, a lot of the students, I think there's a few things that are going on. So let's just be honest. There's been a big decline in trust in institutions and trust in government. So it doesn't have the same kind of, like dream big mentality, which is to start at some G7 government job and work your way up. And also, it's hard to see the immediate impact. Whereas if you can start a company providing floors in Rwanda tomorrow, that's making impact immediately. And then I also say, one of the key things about the GSB is that I mean, I wish I was a student here, but like the social bonds that are built and also the communities people build that are very tied to places like the Bay Area is a very strong pull. And also, you know, people spend 2 years here, they just love it here, you know, and they want to stay here. And the idea of just uprooting and moving to Washington, D.C. or Sacramento or wherever it might be, I think that's kind of lost a lot of its luster compared to the 1970s. So that's at least just my perception. And students are finding other ways. And I think if you think about it, I think a lot of their vision is if I have like a successful private sector career, then 20 years later I can make a higher impact, not as like a G7 employee, but as an advisor, a political appointee. And obviously there's many GSB alumni with that record, like Penny Pritzker and others. And so I think that's what we've seen over the last 20 years.
I'm glad I asked you that, actually, because I have the same exact view as you do. So that was really, that was really terrific to me. And actually, by the way, I think one thing that I will actually be curious to get your thoughts about whether I feel that now our current students are more interested in doing public sector careers at some point in the future than, say, you know, was the case at Stanford some years ago. I wonder if you have that view as well.
I do, and I think it really is about how you scale impact. And I mean, when you talk to a lot of students, that's the mindset they have, which is, and I think it's our motto, right? Which is change organizations, change lives, change the world. I mean, if you really want to change the world, it's really hard to do that from the private sector alone. And so I think kind of going into the public sector after a long career is very enticing to a lot of people because it's really a way they can scale the impact that they've had in their professional careers.
Let me come back to you started with this point that was broader than social impact about the sort of overarching relationship between business and society. So you teach you're right in the middle of this because you teach the first year class that was ethics and now you've turned it into leading with values. So I'd love to give you a chance to just talk a little bit about that transformation of the first year fall class and how we ended up going from having an ethics class to a class that was about leading with values and what that even means.
Sure. I mean, so I think a lot of this kind of started when a book publisher heard about the course and asked me to write me and my co-instructor, Ken Schatz, to write a book about the course. And, you know, you have to have a title for a book. I don't think you can just call the book the name of your class. So we instead said, okay, like what would be a good title for a book? And then decide to rename the class what the book is called. So that's kind of the history of it. So the book is called Leading with Values. And I think maybe kind of our mindset of the class hasn't shifted, but I think what you're saying is right, which is part of leadership, and you know this as much as anybody, not only with your job, but also talking to all the CEOs you do, which is, you know, fundamentally, people follow leaders because they're presenting values that people provide compelling. You know, if your only value that you're offering anybody is that I'll give you X amount of dollars for this amount of work, people will do the minimum amount possible to not get fired. And in this economy right now, that's very little, given where the labor market is right now. But rather, what keeps people like burning the midnight oil and really committed is a set of values that you kind of say, like, this is the values of this organization. And the challenging thing is that people in organization bring different kinds of values. And so how do you both respect the diversity of values in your organization, but also lead with a set of core values? So on the first day of class, we actually showed this video of when Steve Jobs came back to Apple in 1997. So this is when Apple was a crappy company, like really low stock price, and not the $1 trillion plus behemoth it is now. This is, you know, because they hadn't had the iMac or iPad or anything. And he gives a speech, and the speech is basically to the engineers, all of whom have offers at all of the hot .coms, and he's trying to keep them at Apple. And he says, what is the core value of Apple? And he says the core value of Apple is not making boxes that help people get their jobs done, even though they do that better than anybody. He says the core value of Apple is basically to enable people who want to change the world the ability to do so. And the way he put it is, and they had a whole advertising campaign based on this, is that, you know, Mahatma Gandhi, Martin Luther King, Leonardo da Vinci, they never had a computer. But if they had a computer, you'd know it would have been a Mac. And that is what Apple is. It is the computer for those kind of people and the people who buy those computers. And this is the ethos or values that drives that company. And just like Apple has those values, I think every leader of any organization has to say, what are the core values that this organization represents? And I think when you frame the class like that, it's beyond just like ethics, right? It's beyond like not having accounting fraud. It's that what is the purpose of my life and what is the purpose of my work and how do I manage a diverse organization? Because a big thing that's coming up is that, you know, you have employees revolting because they don't like the stances of a company on some social issue. So we try to provide frameworks in the class that say, we're going to have tough discussions in this class. You might disagree with students, but that's not a reason to be disagreeable. That how do we actually have diverse opinions in this classroom and have tough discussions? And really that's what the class is about.
There's so much to unpack there that I think people would love to hear. Let me just pick up on the last point, though, which is the having tough discussions in the classroom. I think everybody is reading all the time how hard that's gotten, and you and Ken do that in the class. How do you do it?
Yeah, it's really, I mean, it's tough. I mean, you know, me and Ken worry every day we're going to get fired or something because of something that comes up in the classroom. But, you know, I think it's really important that we don't shy away from tough discussions in the classroom because it's such a core part of educating business leaders. Because if you shy away now, you're eventually going to have to confront them in the real world. So the first two classes, we just set a great tone. And so the first class, really the lesson of that class is that what is the definition of the value? And fundamentally, the definition of a value is a story. So what do I mean by that? And so there's some things in this world that are not stories, they're facts, like gravity, right? So it doesn't matter if you believe in gravity or not, it's gonna have an effect on you. You can't just like walk off a cliff like Wile E. Coyote and like, you know, just like, oh, like I'm now over the cliff, now I fall. Whereas most things in this world, actually, they do work like the Wile E. Coyote. They do work that people have to then realize that they're off the cliff and then fall. So what do I mean by that? So human rights, for example, is a story. Like justice is a story. Money is a story. They're things that are only real because people believe in them and they give them meaning. And so once you kind of define a value that way, people then realize maybe I was taught different stories than my classmates growing up. And maybe that's why we disagree, because we've been taught a different way the world works, not because something is true or untrue. And then you have more empathy. And then in the second class, we teach them about a theory, which some of you might have heard about. It's called moral foundations theory. Jonathan Haidt wrote a book called The Righteous Mind, which kind of talks about this theory. And it says a lot of how we approach these ethical issues, either in our lives, in business, in politics, is that we have these moral senses. So he has senses like fairness and harm and authority, liberty, et cetera. And, you know, these are all good senses that people have, but some people put more weight on some of them than others. And it's sort of like how some people have really good eyesight, but not so good hearing, and other people have really good hearing, but not such great eyesight. And if you realize that the values that we differ on are just different senses we have, and like the number of true sociopaths in the classroom is probably 0, that everyone's trying to do the right thing. And it's just that we differ on what the values are we put weight on. And I think that sets a nice tone for the class, which allows for disagreement, debate, and discussion later on.
You mentioned basically the new complexities for business leaders that have come up because of the way that societal issues have intersected with business issues. And you know, probably many of us are just in the middle of that in our jobs, and others are reading about it all the time. So I'm curious about what guidance you have for leaders today of organizations about how to navigate those situations where you have employees maybe who have very different views than your customers or the government or the politicians. Disney comes to mind as a case where they had obviously lots of different stakeholders, different views. How do you think about that?
It is such a tough issue. I mean, I'm not going to sugarcoat it. because, I think the Disney example is like, they're just in a very tough position where kind of no matter what they were going to do, like, so you would say, oh, just don't say anything. Well, they did that, and that didn't work. Then it's like, okay, well, take a position. They did that, and now they have their own set of problems. And I think it's sort of just, I think there's two answers to that. So one is, if you just as a leader have a set of core conviction and values, it can help really guide you steady throughout that. And then second, one thing we do in the class is we give students a vocabulary for how you actually explain decisions. And really, I think these frameworks apply to almost all of these, because most of life, for example, is just a trade-off of good stuff. And if you kind of explain, yeah, like we're not getting this good thing, but we're getting this other good thing, I think it can help give people the vocabulary to explain value. So what do I mean by that? Let me give you an example. So, one thing that's really nice is if you grow a pie that's as big as possible for everybody. But a trade-off is that sometimes to grow a big pie, you might have to make the slices of that pie uneven, that it leads to kind of problems in distribution. On the other hand, you might shrink the pie for everybody, but make the slices more even. So if you're going to shrink the pie, that might make a lot of people in your organization mad. But if you can explain that, like, we're doing it because we're making the slices more equal, then people can understand it better. So, one thing we teach about is kind of the framework of the veil of ignorance that John Rawls had. And many of our students, especially our international students, this is the first time they're encountering these ideas. And it kind of blows their mind. And if you kind of explain to them, well, one way to justify, a decision is to say, if you didn't know who you were going to be in this company, like, yeah, you're the vice president of marketing, but if you could have been a janitor in this company, what would be the rules that you would have and kind of do? And then what do you think that would be? And just having that kind of language to put people behind the veil of ignorance, to think empathetically, it can actually make it more convincing to do things that are going to shrink the pie, right? Because it might increase something else good, like fairness or distribution.
The issue of inequality that you're raising, you're a political scientist. You actually spend a lot of your time thinking about inequality, and I'm wondering how that comes up in the class. Issues of inequality in your Leading with Values class, and how you broach those issues with students.
Yeah, I think a lot of this comes down to the debate between kind of stakeholder and shareholder capitalism. When we have a whole kind of session, two maybe, where we kind of break out what this actually means. And students kind of differ on that. I would say, some students, we teach them kind of what Milton Friedman says about why it's actually a moral argument to only care about your shareholders' interests, because it's their money. And if you do what you want and don't do what your shareholders want, you're stealing their money, essentially. That's kind of his argument. And then we talk about other ways of thinking about it, which is to think about the fact that the only reason the company has highways for people to get to work, the only reason they have employees that have an education system, is that they're part of a broader society, and there's a social contract that companies are part of, that they have to look out for multiple stakeholder interests. And we don't take a side on that. Some students say, yes, we only take into account stakeholder interests because it's for long-term shareholder value. And others say, no, we have to kind of take into account things like inequality, et cetera. Even if the government isn't doing something, the companies have to take it. And we don't take a side on that. We actually have those tough discussions. I'd also say this issue comes up in CSI a lot. So I don't know if people know about this book called Winners Take All by Anand Giridharadas. And that book, I'll be honest with you, basically is just everything we do at CSI is bad. Right? It's a big broadside against philanthropy, impact investing, social entrepreneurship. And the argument he makes is that these things kind of paper over structural inequality caused by lack of government regulation and policies. And I've always responded to that saying it's not an either or thing, right? That I think our students are very interested in structural reform on issues like inequality. And they view that until those happen, business actually plays a big role in potentially reducing some of those inequalities. But we teach about all of this stuff because I think for business leaders to go out there, having a sense that their businesses are embedded in a broader social framework where issues like inequality are becoming a bigger problem, I think is important.
Where would you say, if you had to kind of size it up for these folks, where would you say our students are on the stakeholders, shareholders? If you sort of, what would you say the student perspective is these days?
I take a vote actually after all of we have a small group, and after, the great thing is we have a really in-depth discussion, and then we do the vote. And I would say, almost none of our students believe that the goal is to increase the shareholder price in the next quarter so you keep your job as CEO. Like, that's not really how our students think. They're much more nuanced than that. I would say 75% of them believe in what you would call an enlightened Milton Friedman view, which is my job is to maximize shareholder value, and the way I do that long term is by being sensitive and cognizant of shareholder interests or stakeholder interests. And that encapsulates things like regulatory risk of being canceled on social media, like all of that stuff. And I would say 25% believe in what you would call a pluralistic stakeholder model, which is that there are edge cases where you would choose a stakeholder, whether it's your employees, an indigenous community somewhere, things like that, over the shareholder interests, even if it might damage the shareholder value. So I would say it's like 75-25.
All right, now I'm going to ask you a hard question, which is, if you think back to you mentioned Milton Friedman. If you think back, so I'm an economist, so I'm just going to have to go with give you a little Milton Friedman for a moment. But if you think back, Milton Friedman was writing in the early 1970s, right? It was a time of incredible social unrest, a lot of debates about business, its role in society, and so forth. And Friedman's ideas won the day, 1971, right? And the Chicago School won the day. All right, so let's say we're going to have the Stanford School that starts in 2022, articulates a different view of what capitalism is going to look like, or maybe a view of what capitalism will look like, and that's the next 50 years. What's your view of what it should be?
That's a really hard question. That's like really putting me on the spot here. I actually think that's a lot of what our faculty are working on, frankly, and it's actually why we have over 100 people doing the research on these questions. Looking at how marketplaces are going to be structured from an economics perspective. Looking at how you have behavior change from an OB perspective. Like, I think that's what we're all doing. I don't think it's like my personal opinion on how to do that. But I think it is. I think that's something that's very hard to predict. And the one thing I just see right now that's, I think, very challenging for business leaders is that I would say the divide between business elites and the mass public has never been as far as it's been for a long time. And I think there's a lot of reasons for that. And society has changed a lot. But I think the image of the 1950s of the business leader, in the Rotary Club, doing the community service, embedded in the community, running the company town, we have to find what is the 21st century version of that. Because it can't be what was the last 20 years, which is like a single-minded, how do you increase the stock price for the next quarter? Like, that's just not going to work anymore. But running the Rotary Club in the town with high amounts of social capital, that's also probably not the solution. I think our society's kind of past that. So I think you have to think creatively, which is like, how, as a business leader, as a person, going to be running a company, but also be embedded in their society, building social capital in their communities. And I wish I had an easy answer for that. But it's very hard when people are glued to their phones, 10 hours a day, and it could be even harder 20 years from now when people are in the metaverse and things like that. So, or easier, who knows? But I think it's very hard to predict what 50 years is going to be like when things change so fast. You can't even predict what 5 years is going to be like.
One thing that's just interesting to me in what you're saying is, when you think about the way that the role of people's relationships to their jobs and to companies has changed over time, with the decline of trust in government and with the decline of civic organizations and some of the Rotary clubs, so to speak, that you're talking about, people look much more to their companies and their employers to fill gaps that were not there, whether it's in solving societal problems or just providing a social fabric. And of course, they want that social fabric to align with their values. And so, I think that's such an interesting set of points you're raising, and helps you to see the link between, dedicated careers or aspirations around social impact, whether it's impact investing or social entrepreneurship, and just the way you're teaching all of our students about the roles they might play as leaders in organizations. I think that's really an interesting, important set of points.
How would you answer that question, though, about how you think capitalism is going to
I thought I was asking you the questions.
Well, that was only fair when you were asking easy questions. So now that you're asking a very hard question, I'm curious what your view on it is.
All right, I'm going to tell, I've got two stories, but then I'll give my answer. But I'll just say, we have a class in the winter course. The leading vows is in the fall quarter. In the winter quarter, we now have a corporate finance class was turned into a corporate governance class. Basically, because if you thought about the things that were you think what's on the front page of the Wall Street Journal when the class was originally designed in 1990, it was all debt and equity and leverage buyouts and things like that. What's on the front page of the Wall Street Journal now? It's stakeholder capitalism, basically. It's what are CEOs saying? What is the Twitter board going to do when Elon Musk comes and wants to buy it? How are they going to resolve the price versus the effects on democracy and all that? So I went in I do a session every year in that on stakeholders versus shareholders, and we went in this year, and just like you do, we did a survey of where people aligned among the students. And the students came out 92%, hard on the stakeholder side. And there were like 4 people who were Milton Friedman people, and then like 4 who refused to answer. And so I came into the class and I said, you know what? Like with a bunch of us who were in a panel, and I said, I'm going to just stake out the hardline Milton Friedman position because I actually want you to hear it, and I think you should hear all the views, and then we can argue about them. And it was so much fun, actually. We just repeated it on Wednesday. We decided to have a second round where people could argue it again, and we got the group together again on Wednesday for lunch. So let me preface it by saying the Friedman view, which is how I was educated as an economist, which is that appreciating that business is all about solving people's problems. Every business starts because you see some problem in the world and then you go out and solve it. And having clarity about what is the problem you're solving and how do you create value for people so they'll pay you actually that's great. That's the source of innovation. That's the reason the United States grew for 150 years, and it's what's brought people out of poverty all across the world. It's an amazingly powerful thing. But I think what I would add to that is that we now are in a world where the bifurcation, where businesses were doing that, and we left it to government to solve big societal challenges, is not necessarily working that well. And I view the part of the failing of our political institutions, and maybe the decline of civic institutions and other things, has just left this void where, in some sense, business is more trusted than these other areas and does need, in certain ways, to stand in. And the hard part for companies and for leaders today is just trying to do exactly what you were talking about, which is figure out where do you step in. Because you can't solve every problem in the world. If you're running a software business, you can't, you got to figure out which are the places where you could make a difference and have impact in a company as a leader. And I think that has actually made the world much, much harder for business leaders than it was even 5 or 10 or 15 years ago. And so I think, when I think of like the challenge we have today of educating students, I'm sure you all were hard to educate too, but maybe you were a little bit easier and in some sense you went out into a little bit less complicated world than our students are about to graduate into. And so there's an enormous onus on us now, and I think everyone was inspired by hearing how you're doing it, because it's incredible to actually prepare students to go out into that world and navigate all those complexities and figure out, how am I going to build and lead an organization or participate and help to build an organization or invest in organizations that are going to create value for people and hopefully not do damage to society, but actually reinforce society and all the institutions that we need collectively to thrive. And yeah, that's a great mission. It makes it exciting to be at Stanford Business School. One thing I'll finish by saying, and then I'm going to go to questions take a few questions, is the nice thing about being in a world where things are all mixed up and complicated is it's a great time to be in school. And I mean that in both ways. One is it's probably nice not to be working at Twitter right now, but the other is that it's interesting to be here because people are arguing about all the things that they're doing in Neil's class, and the questions are hard and fun, and you get into them, and that's really exciting. And Stanford's a place where you can have many ideas that flourish. And so you can actually have those discussions that everyone wants to and hopes that we could have in this country, or at least we're trying to do that. And you're doing it in your class as well as I've ever seen anyone do it, which is amazing. So let's take a couple questions, and we're the only thing that stands between you and a beer. So we'll just take a couple, but if anyone has questions, we'll take our best shot at them. Yeah.
Hey guys, I'm Nadeem. So I work for a private company that's not profitable and growing quickly. It's about 3,000 people. So there's a lot of tensions in where to invest capital. But as we're getting bigger and hopefully public someday, I already see a lot of demand, pressure, tension to become de facto government or community, right? Whatever those demands are from the employee base. So how do you think about, maybe this comes up in class, balancing people selecting where they want to work and having the values be really clear versus every company has to address every possible employee demand or value. Like, how do you, Twitter's I guess an example of that, but how do you think of that more generally?
Well, I'll give my thing. You can
respond. I'd love to hear your answer.
Well, I'll just say there's different models, and I'm not going to say what's the right model. I think our job is to just discuss it, just say this is what the world looks like to the students, and then they can kind of select. So I don't know if you know about Coinbase. So Coinbase, had a very interesting mission statement, which is this is not going to be a political company. If you think this is a political company, we don't want you to work here, and that's a red line in the sand, and they're just hoping that selection works, and that's what it is. And we'll see what happens with them, but that's kind of an approach to take, to say we're not going to be a government or serve those functions. On the other hand, there's other companies that are clearly causing externalities in the world, like Exxon Mobil. There's just no doubt about it, is that they create externalities. They do a lot of great stuff, they create energy that has saved countless lives over the history of the last 50 years. I mean, fossil fuels are responsible for so much saving of life, and now they could be damaging a lot of life. That's why the world is complex. There's trade-offs. And they have to say, okay, well, normally you would say, well, the government is going to make the decisions. They're either going to provide subsidies for fossil fuels, they're going to have carbon taxes, whatever they do, they're going to do, and we're going to be in those constraints, and we're not going to be the government. But they actually have a lot more harder questions that they've had to face. So one is, how do you lobby, right? Do you lobby to change those regulations? And Milton Friedman never mentions the word lobbying once in his article. And it's kind of a blind spot in that article. And then the second thing is that they've done something that I study, which is called outside lobbying. So they create their own organizations, and the fossil fuel industry has in the past created organizations that have spread climate change misinformation. So is that something that was appropriate for them to have done? It was good for shareholder value, they would claim, but was it the right ethical thing to do? And so I would say there's different models, but I think companies have to ask themselves hard questions, which is, one, do we just want to say we're not a government? And that could be what your company ends up doing. Or say, well, do we restrain ourselves from being in the social sector at all, including lobbying and influence, knowing that's not maximizing shareholder value, but might be the right thing to do, and actually trust government to have its true regulatory function separate from from company influence. I don't know what you think.
I worry about a world where where people sort among their jobs, the way they sort among many other things, like the places where they live, based on the sort of things that they believe or their political preferences. I think that I worry about what that would do to this country. It's already happening in some sense. I mean, you look at the political skew of the tech companies, say, versus other industries, say the fossil fuel industries. They're very, very different. And I think one of the problems in our country today is exactly that there's not enough mixing of people who have different views or different ideologies or different preferences. We need to push back against that. I mean, that is a central challenge for us here at the university, because it's so important to have the free flow of ideas and people taking different positions and have that whole spectrum. And it's hard for companies. I look at even just companies that here in our local companies that have all kinds of challenges with employees getting on the internal message boards and fighting it out and creating challenges. But I actually think it's a good thing. The more you can have companies where you have an employee workforce where people are who have very different preferences, who might have different political ideologies, who might have different backgrounds, just different in every possible way, and they can come together around a common mission. That's powerful. And I'll just give you one example. Neil mentioned Mary Barra, our alum. General Motors, 220,000 employees. That's a really broad and diverse workforce in every possible dimension. And I thought one of the amazing things that happened during the pandemic was right at the beginning of the pandemic, when Mary said we're gonna start producing ventilators, and they opened up a factory that was closed, and they started producing ventilators. Actually, there was a whole group of, this wasn't in the news, but there was a whole group of other GSB alumni who were in Washington, that were helping coordinate that with the government. Came out of, I think they were all at Bain, and then they came and went to Washington and worked in the class of 2015 was the class that a lot of them came from. And that was great. I mean, what a great thing. Isn't that what you want to see in this country, is people from so many different backgrounds, perspectives, come together on a mission, and if it can happen inside a company, that's a win for the country. So that's how I would think about it. But of course, I don't have to be in one of those companies and then deal with all the people, fighting it out with each other. I just have to be at Stanford dealing with all the people who are have different perspectives. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you for that. I'm class of 2002, so for me, what's really interesting, I haven't been in school for a long time, and it's great to hear what students are talking about and how the program runs. I think many of us who are hiring people, we're facing exactly the same issues, right? Because today, it's not enough anymore to say, like, we're a company that's going to produce a lot of profit. You're going to be part of that. You're going to help us grow. Everyone wants to know there's values in the company, whatever they are. I'm really worried, though, about the other topic that you, Dean, talked about, which is the political process and the political fabric. I think it's incredibly hard to operate in a country where the political process is increasingly broken. We've got a hard time getting a budget. I've talked with Bob Gates recently about the situation in the Pentagon, where military programs are being underfunded, and it just seems consensus is much harder to find. Now, I think for a company to prosper, you have to be in a country that actually has a certain structural framework or legal framework that allows you to do business. So I think it's a really worrying trend. Can you share with us a little bit what your students today think about that and how they see the political process and what your take is on that? I think it's one of the biggest threats that we face as a Western world.
I'm kicking that one to you because you are one of the leading American political scientists. So,
I mean, I would say that from the students' perspective, when I came in 2008, there was really not that much political interest among the students. I mean, they kind of did, but it wasn't, I think it was like, oh, I'm a business person first and foremost. And just over the last 14 years, exactly for the reasons you're talking about, I think they've naturally realized this is something we've got to really care about, talk about, discuss. You're exactly right. You need to have well-functioning institutions to have a good capitalist economy. And I know political economists have debated what comes first. Does the institutions come first or the capitalism come first? I personally believe that the institutions come first. Like, I think you need to have good institutions. And I'll give you an example. We have Keith Hennessy teaches one of the most popular classes, and the class has almost nothing to do with business. It's just kind of like how you pass bills in Washington. And it's one of the most popular classes in the entire school. And he's like a hardcore Republican, where I would say like the median student probably, voted for Joe Biden. And they're taking the class for someone who worked for George W. Bush. And I think that reflects not only he's a great teacher, it's a great class, but also I think the students, share a lot of what you're thinking, which is you really have to be educated in this stuff to be a good business leader, to help strengthen and build our institutions, not undermine them. And I don't want to get too political here, but it's interesting because you had a lot of companies after the insurrection say we're not going to donate to some people who were involved in the insurrection. And then you have Toyota now reversing that decision, and FEC records are now showing they have been donating. So I think these are tough questions, and the students are really interested in them, and exactly for the reasons, because it's the bedrock of a strong, successful capitalist economy, is having a strong democracy.
I'll just add one sort of twist on that, which is the school has, over time, expanded the number of students who are international students. Actually, this year's MBA 1 class, because we had some international students deferred during the pandemic, 46% of the class is international. That's higher than normal and probably higher than next year's class will be, but it's been in the low 40s. And there's students in the class now from 65 or 70 countries. And increasingly more students who come from Latin America, from Africa, from Southeast Asia, who come from countries that don't have necessarily stable political institutions. And I think those questions around, both the importance of political institutions as a foundation for business, and also the role of business in helping to bolster political institutions and build stronger institutions of rule of law, are so enriched by having those students, because they just come in and actually all those questions are obvious to them. It's yes, you do. If you don't have, you don't want your country to be Venezuela. It's really hard to run a business there. So how do you have more stable political institutions? That's a absolute precursor. Go ahead, sorry.
Well, I said I love having all students who have, in their lives, undergone democratic transitions. Yeah. And it's kind of in those middle-income countries, too, where there's been democratic backsliding. They grew up in a democracy, and now they came here from kind of an autocratic government, and they're just a great perspective to teach our American students. And they're a great perspective to teach the students who are from weaker political institutions. And just having the international diversity is so great, because not only do they bring different cultural perspectives, different business perspectives, but these different political perspectives as well. And I've just learned so much talking to students who've actually lived through democratic transition, And
I'll give you one example in the reverse, which was really inspiring earlier this winter. But when the war in Ukraine started, we have a non-trivial number of students, both from Russia and from the Ukraine. And it was hugely upsetting to everyone, but it was really devastating to the students from those countries, and also from Eastern Europe, other affected areas. And one of the first things that the students did, the Russian students and the Ukrainian students together, was to organize a discussion for all of their classmates to just talk about it. And I just thought that was about the greatest thing that had happened, that they sort of came together and had this discussion, hosted all their classmates, and they've done a couple of those, and it was great. It was inspiring. You also could, if you get a chance, you should read about one of our MBA students who's Ukrainian, Kate Slyankova, who organized this really heroic humanitarian effort to bring medical supplies into the Ukraine, and got a former military, now current medical school student at Stanford to fly the supplies over in a chartered plane. So that was a recent effort that happened here on campus just after the war started. It was great. It was really, really exciting.
So it sounds like a phenomenal class and program, and so two quick questions. One is there any sort of executive education, continuing studies, or online manifestation of it? I don't self-identify a lot in this space, but I found this super engaging and would love to, maybe others are interested. That's part one. And part two, both of the books you mentioned, I think Jonathan Haidt and Winner Takes All were favorites of mine. I'm wondering if you have a tip for us, a favorite blogger, podcaster, columnist, economist, or a writer, just something that we might take up for summer reading if we're interested in this type of space. And to both of you, if you're, to the extent you have an answer.
Yeah.
Why don't you start?
Are there programs, are there executive programs with this? You have an executive program, but it's not, it doesn't, would you say it falls into this category?
Is this the...
Sort of thinking about these sort of issues? Well,
The PE one.
Yeah.
We do have a program on what you would call kind of reputation management and kind of political economy and these kind of issues and business government relations. We do have one. I believe it's being taught this summer. Also, CSI has put a lot of stuff online. So we recently published a book with Harvard Business Review Press, which basically kind of shares our curriculum with the world. So you can, that book, if you're interested, it's basically our curriculum right there, and then we have a lot of online content that goes with the book. So if you kind of go to our website, you'll see all these videos we have on impact investing and modeling and theory of change and all of the concepts that are in the book.
I think, though, that you're planting an interesting seed, because I would say in our executive programs, all these issues we've been talking about, I think, do come in now, because it's just so critical to leadership, and we have leaders who want to find out what's going on. But we haven't necessarily. Our executive education has been extremely disrupted during the pandemic. Like, it went to zero during the pandemic, and now we're restarting it, and we haven't developed something that would be around, say, this kind of leading with values or leading in a time of sort of social turbulence. And maybe that's what you'll have to do next summer.
You just gave me like a new job to do, so thank you for that. Yeah.
All right, we're at quarter of, and I think everyone could use a beer at this point in the day. I certainly could. So let me just thank you all for being here. I have to say today, just like walking around the campus and seeing, this was the first day that we've had at the GSB the entire year. We did have fall reunions, but everyone was wearing masks all the time and a little nervous about interacting with each other. And I think as I was walking campus today, I said to someone, this is the first day the entire year where I have really felt like we're at full strength. We've got the faculty here, we've got the students here, the staff is here, and the alumni are here, and it feels great. So thank you for doing that, and I hope you just have a really wonderful reunion. We're so happy to have you back.
Thanks for all the good questions.
That was great. That was fun.